Hi everyone, I'm Marsha. I am a founding member of Green Ribbon Group, and today with me here I have Ariane, co-founder of Green Ribbon Group, and Sinatra, an independent researcher who joined us on this project. So Ariane and Sinatra work together as research analysts and policy experts back in ISIS. ISIS as in the Institute of Strategic and International Studies. Why do we introduce ourselves even more? If Ariane and Sinatra, if you want to.
Sure, thank you, Masha. As Masha said, I am co-founder of the Green Ribbon Group. It's my friend, Muhammad Sinatra. Sinatra and I were both previously analysts, roommates actually, when we were working at a think tank here. This year, the Green Ribbon Group, we have decided to embark on a workplace mental health research series. So I've asked him to join us to look more in depth into this topic on year 3 of championing a community approach to mental health.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Muhammad Sinatra. I used to be an analyst in foreign policy and security studies back then in ISIS Malaysia. I was, as Ariane said, I was her roommate for 6-7 years. Yeah, but in the past 2 years, I have since left ISIS and became a freelance researcher, taking on multiple projects in different disciplines. And this year, Ariane actually asked me to join this particular research project on mental health, which is a completely new thing to me, but has been quite an amazing experience thus far.
I think that is in line with our approach anyways. I mean, just a refresher for everyone. GRG, Green Ribbon Group, just a reminder for everyone, GRG champions a community approach to mental health, which essentially means that you, me, Ariane, Sinatra, we can all contribute to mental health care in ways that we can, like in our own capacities. The notion that we have to be a professional in the mental health field is not true to contribute to mental health. So I think this should be replicated with not only research-wise, but just awareness, general awareness, or just any activity at all on mental health. So I'm sure you guys are wondering why we're here today. As Ariane mentioned before, we're producing a 6-part research paper on workplace mental health. Last year, our focus, the first year since GRD's inception, our focus was on general community mental health. It was a response to the pandemic at that point. And last year, we focused on student mental health. So this year, we decided why not we focus on workplace mental health again. So as of October 2023, GRG, Ariane and Sinatra, has published 4 research papers discussing different perspectives on workplace mental health, specifically when re-entering the physical workplace post-pandemic. These perceptions include senior leaders, managers, and Gen Zs. And today we're here to discuss those perceptions. So, why don't we start?
First question.
The first start?
Yeah.
I think the first question to start, I think we should just discuss or rather get your perceptions on what are the traditional and modern practices of workplace. As for me, I'm a Gen Z, right? So what I'm used to is in a way, I'm a COVID baby for workplace or for work, right? So when I was finishing my studies, the pandemic happened. So I graduated online. I did my studies online, and I started working in the COVID situation too, in the COVID scene. So what I'm used to when it comes to workplace practices is completely different than what you guys are used to, right? So what are the differences to you when it comes to the traditional and modern workplace practices?
Actually, for me personally, I've been exposed to multiple experiences myself because obviously you and I, we had that pre-pandemic traditional workplace settings, right? When we had to be present in our office from 9 to 5, deliver our jobs, have these constant interactions with our colleagues, our bosses on daily basis, like even attend events in like places, like even go to multiple countries, like to present papers or like attend conferences. But obviously that all changed in the pandemic, so we had to back then we had to like adjust our working schedule, working like arrangement as well. So like everyone went like work from home and then later maybe hybrid. But I think the turning point for both of us was 2021 when you first left, and then you had all these your own arrangements, like mostly work from home, but you also had your own office, right? And a year later, I also left. And then what did I do? I became a freelance research analyst, where basically I did everything back home from the safe comfort of my room sometimes, and now I have my own office. But sometimes all these projects also compelled me to go to different places, like in the depths of a jungle, for example, or like
That's cool.
places in Jakarta or now in Kuala Lumpur. So I've been exposed to different kinds of like settings as well. And what you mentioned just now about you being a Gen Z, like being a pandemic baby, okay, in that sense,
Work
like
pandemic, baby.
pandemic baby, your experience has actually been felt for most of the Gen Zs as well, because they were the first generations who had to go to schools like fully online, and then when they transitioned to work, some of them had to go through this whole like work from home arrangement as well, and then later on it became like hybrid, and then now Kuala Lumpur, at least I know they are starting to return back to work like full time, like pre-pandemic setting, and it has been quite a challenge for some Gen Zs that we've interviewed in our research thus far. Like, if you want to add on.
I think the general differences that I would summarize between, I suppose, workplaces pre-pandemic and workplaces today, they can kind of be wrapped up in, I think, two very simple words. Okay? The first is expectations. I think expectations have changed quite a bit pre-pandemic and now post. And I think that is apparent throughout the organization in general. So from key leaders at the top to managers, to those in the operational day-to-day tasks, but also young professionals, so Gen Zs like yourselves. For instance, I think when it comes to people, for instance, women my age, right? We are mid-30s. I'm not married, but I do have a lot of friends who are married, and in their 30s, women, they tend to settle down a lot later than they did, or rather a lot later than the generations of our parents. So that happens in their 30s. They start to reproduce, right? So they start to play more of that maternal role, which takes up a lot of their time. So even though they were used to working 9 to 5 pre-pandemic, that expectation has shifted nonetheless post-pandemic, to the point where it's not just a question of Gen Zs wanting flexible work arrangements. Sure, that's a given, because like you've said, it's the only thing that you know, right? But it's also, I think, a question of expectations changing across the board. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think, adaptability. Okay, when it comes to this issue of change, we had to adapt. 2020, in March, April, we didn't go to work anymore, but we still had to deliver. For instance, at that time, ISIS, we really like to do a lot of infographics. So a lot of work on not Canva, but picture chart was the go-to back then. This was only like 3 years ago. That was quite difficult to do it online, because we would do it together always.
Have to sit next to each other.
Yeah. So, it's group work, because, for instance, it would be summaries on a group project that would, I don't know, include 3 to 5 researchers. So to kind of do that in your own sort of homes, and to be able to do that online, I think
Big change.
yeah, that was a bit of a change, and obviously it then didn't felt like how it used to feel. So then it was that whole, at least for me, I felt very like, okay, so actually, like, what am I doing? And I felt very like, okay, is it time for a shift? Because we're experiencing something so new across the globe. Is it time for me to do something new as well? So it was actually one of the reasons why I decided, I think I had this chat with you, that, I think it's time to start something. And at that time, come November 2020, we were how many months in? Maybe 6-7 months into the pandemic. We had 1 or 2 MCOs already. There was more coverage of mental health in the news. So eventually, me, myself, and Puteri decided, okay, it's time to start something and just raise awareness about it. Because I think on this issue of mental health, there is a need to just simply talk more about it, because it's not being done enough. And by talking more, awareness will, well, hopefully, and I think it has, increased. And stigma, slowly but surely, will decrease. So yeah, I think it's just about having expectations differ between workplaces then and now, and being adaptable to change, and to what extent I think individuals are prepared or not really prepared to sort of walk down that route.
Throughout your interaction with all these groups, what do you encounter?
I think we should begin by just generally introducing this research series, right? So as you mentioned before, it's 6 papers that dives into the different perceptions when it comes to this term workplace mental health. right? We started with a survey that we ran online throughout the month of May this year. We had 500 respondents. Not everyone completed, which just sort of, I think, attests to the level of awareness or perhaps even stigma that people have when it comes to answering a survey on workplace mental health, right? That's the first thing. In terms of the specific assumptions, we didn't want this study to be a typical mental health study in a sense that, like, we didn't ask questions in our survey and in the interviews that we've done. We didn't ask questions like, you know, Masha, how many days a month would you say you are severely stressed at work? Or when was the last time you felt severely burnt out? We were not really after those types of indicators, not because they don't matter, but for us, the whole aim is to try and champion a community approach to workplace mental health. And our premise is that it's very difficult to build such an approach if there is no understanding between the different designations or generations under the same roof, or rather under one organization, right? So the assumptions that we had were actually fairly straight to the point, and we start to introduce this in paper 2, where we deep dive into the different designations. We began with senior leaders. The assumptions that we made are this: one's perception of mental health differs according to where you sit in an org. We roughly divided the organization into 3: senior leaders, managers, operational or young professionals, right? And the assumption is that, for instance, those in the operational roles, because you are responsible for day-to-day tasks of running an organization. If you're, let's say, if you're in administration, right? The brunt of workplace mental health, like for instance, stress, will be felt on them a bit more than on the other two, just because you are responsible for the day-to-day running of it. A manager, like you said, dissipate, which is actually the title of our 4th paper. So the middleman, and we actually use the term like the sandwich manager in the paper, because you're literally in between top and bottom, right? So a manager has to juggle too. So you're meant to support the senior leader on more long-term strategic sort of planning, but you also need to support those in the operation, on like things that they would have to do every day. Whereas if you're correct, but if you're a senior leader, it's very long term. So you do things like budgeting for next year, right? So you have time. Whereas if you are a manager and an operational role, it's a bit more condensed. So that was our very simple assumption. Your perception of workplace mental health really depends on where you are in an organization, because it I suppose is influenced. I think the word I would use is influence. It's influenced by your responsibilities when it comes to your work, and also your responsibilities when it comes to mental health in the organization. Of course, certain things when it comes to mental health in general, we are responsible for when it comes to our own mental health. But when you look at, for instance, responsibilities of mental health in the workplace, it's different for different tiers. Like for instance, senior leaders, managers, the expectations then is on you to create that safe space for your employees to be able to share a bit more about what they are going through. Like for instance, certain stresses, certain triggers that may, perhaps not the term triggers, but perhaps certain things that may deem that particular workplace, and the word is unsafe, right? So that was generally how we sort of framed our research. It's just based on that, very simple. It really depends where you are in an organization, because it depends on what your job scope is, and it also depends on what your responsibilities are vis-a-vis. But in terms of the specific findings, Sinatra can provide a deep dive.
Okay, so I think you touched a little bit already on the manager sides, and I think we have to be clear from the get-go that across the board, the 3 designations, there's a vast level of awareness towards mental health in the first place. Okay.
Okay.
So like 97% of our survey respondents actually see that linkage between performance in the workplace and mental well-being. So there's already that level of awareness
Across all
three designations. However, we need to approach this whole concept from a more the perspective of a trend, like a discourse. Like obviously it's a trend now, right? So one of our interviews actually mentioned that it's actually a trend, like it's the thing, the in thing now. Yeah, workplace mental health. So so there's also a tendency for our respondents and interviewees to actually also agree with this whole like imperatives of mental health in the workplace. Obviously, okay, that's fine. There's awareness, but there's also it's different between being aware about it and knowing what you have to do about it.
Right.
So, for example, I think you answered some of the questions already. Like Gen Zs, kind of more clear about what they expect from the workplace. They would like the workplace to be more sensitive towards mental health imperatives. They want more flexibility, right, in the workplace.
Deal breaker.
Yeah.
Flexibility is not provided. It's a straight on. That's a very black and white issue.
If they are forced to come back to work 9 to 5 every day, Monday to Friday, I think to many of Gen Zs in Klang Valley at least, it would be a deal breaker for them.
Right.
Yeah. So for Gen Zs, it seems from our interviews and engagements, they are more clear of what they expect from this whole mental health concept, right? Like at the workplace.
Well-being in general.
Yeah, in general. Senior leaders, however, there are more nuances to it. Like they all agree that mental health is important, but I don't
Something
think
that they need to start thinking about if they haven't already.
and they have to implement in the workplace, but they are not sure how to implement it, and then they differ on the framework of it in each workplace. One industry that we talked to, he basically said that we don't ever talk about mental health in my office. Like it's something
was
that we never discussed. So we never discuss about this ever.
The construction industry.
And this is probably this ties back to the generational issues, because apparently in the construction industry it's filled with elder generations like Gen X and Boomers who have a very specific lens when they look into like psychological aspect of life. For example, you mentioned that elder generations, they prefer to see stress as something that you just have to deal with in life, right?
Because everyone gets stressed out.
Instead of framing it as a mental health thing,
Correct,
so there is that. So that's the construction industry, if I'm not mistaken, right? So there's also another industry who say like, oh, okay, yes, we understand it's important. I think it's the advertising industry. Yes, it's important. We try to do something about it, but the nature of the work kind of prohibits meaningful steps to be done in this industry because of the nature of the work. It's very fast-paced, and you have to like meet the criteria. You have to service all the client's demands, right? If you fail to deliver in the right time, because you have to do all this like mental health side programs or whatever, then basically you're failing to fulfill your responsibilities to your clients, right? Who are paying your bills and all. So that's from the advertising industry. There's also another industry who said, workplace mental health basically has to do with architecture. Like we have to make it like safe for the people to feel comfortable in the office. Yeah.
Okay.
When you go to office, you feel like it's a comfortable office. Then it will somehow translate into your mental health in the workplace. So there's always that kind of like different definitions of what mental health framework is to different senior leaders. And it's even more difficult to talk about what senior leaders want, because they each approach the issue from a different lens. Right. So I think one of our conclusions for paper 2, if I'm not mistaken, was that there's no one-size-fits-all for workplace mental health solutions, because there's no disagreement yet. And I think this disagreement arises from this lack of awareness of what mental health really is. Forget about workplace mental health. We're talking about just mental health in general.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
So I think varies across industry, right? For instance, when we spoke to the senior leader in construction, he says the construction industry is such that you do operate on late nights, like site visits. You're not going to be sitting to 5 at a desk. You will be out and about. right? You'll be, perhaps you visit a site at 8, 9 p.m. at night, for instance, right? But would that be deemed as not mentally or rather psychologically unsafe because you're working long hours?
Yes, more time
Right?
and all.
Yeah.
And more labor intensive.
Yes, correct. And also, I think it varies according to the size of an organization. So if you have, let's say, more than 1,000 employees, then the assumption is you have more hands on deck. But if you are a smaller organization, okay, like for instance, we can be very frank and talk about GRG. We have always been a very small team. I think the most we have been is 5 packs. Okay, so when one person is not well, okay, it's really felt by the other 4.
Yes.
Because on the one hand, it's very clear. Like for instance, I would say in a small organization like Green Ribbon, where you have less than 10 employees, or even if you go up to, I don't know, 0 to 50 employees, you are very clear who does what. So your job scope is very black and white. Masha was responsible for this. I did this. Tengku Iman is doing all these things. It's very, it's. I mean, I would say that there are no overlaps, right?
Yeah.
But if somebody is not well, let's say, and they need to take 3-4 days, like that person's absence is felt on all 4, because maybe we cannot jalan on things that are meant to already.
Yes.
So it depends, I think, across industry and also on the size of the organization. For instance, if you look at startups, we actually need to do a bit more of this. We actually should look into workplace mental health of startups, because I think that's like different altogether as well. For instance, having the need to fundraise, having the need to, and people always say this: if you join a startup, you need to be a jack of all trades. So you have to do a lot of things because you need to fit in like the job scopes of many. And this was raised as an issue for one particular Gen Z during a focus group discussion that we had. So she says, I'm a jack of all trades in my startup, but I fear that I'm not an expert in anything. And that worries me for my number 1 career progression, because I'm not good in any one thing that will allow me to rise. Okay. And number 2, in terms of my sense of purpose in the workplace, I'm not sure what it is, because I just do a lot of things, but I'm not doing one thing that I can see like real progress and development in. There are different ways of looking at it, and again, it comes to me, I feel anyway, comes down to your position in the org, the size of
It's
it.
interesting though, because I had this, I went for this one all girls, it was a mentor-mentee thing that we went to, right? And I was speaking to one of the mentors, right? And she was saying how becoming a generalist is better than becoming a specialist, because then you would have a hand in all projects, and that would lead for you to become more visible in the workplace of maybe like maybe 200, 300, or maybe like 1,000 employees. You will stand out more because you can do things from every angle. But I understand where that Gen Z was coming from, because I myself have me in the GRG setting as well. I had to, yes, and I was I mean, of course I had to do a few things, and I was also at one point wondering, okay, what am I actually good at, right? Because I like to do a lot of things. I like to talk. I especially love to talk, but am I really good at it? Because I don't quite spend a lot of time in that in the early days, yeah. But I think going back to what you said about the mental health practices that should be in place, I think that's also an issue, or not an issue, but rather a challenge for Malaysia to take on, because it does differ from the different lines of work. Right? Like you said, construction, it's more labor intensive. How are you going to implement mental health practices when you're not even in the office, for example?
Yep.
Right? Like, is it a matter of your physical safety, or is it a matter of your mental safety in the workplace, for example, in the construction? So
Yeah.
I think that's a challenge as well. But before we move on into the solutions, I would like to know more, and I'm sure our viewers would like to know more on key findings of each report. So perhaps maybe you can share.
My God, key findings.
More of the general findings. So
Go ahead.
So paper 1 here, so this is more a summary of the survey that we did. So as I mentioned, we hit our target at 500 respondents, but not all 500 actually completed it. So I think we had a completion rate of
Yeah, 66%.
66% late. So, which translates to 329 respondents, right? So out of 500 respondents, 329 actually completed it. So that's the first thing. But a limitation, I suppose, is the very stark differences in responses between men and women. So it wasn't a 50-50. It was 70% women and 30% men. So we know when it comes to mental health in general, men may not be as comfortable as women in terms of, for instance, even to fill up an online anonymous survey, in private was difficult for men.
Leave alone speaking about it.
So what more to actually be doing something like this, where you actually speak out openly about mental
Am I
health.
speaking out openly like
Right. I mean, you're giving your views, right? So that's one. We obviously targeted across the whole country, but the majority of our responses, I think, not surprisingly, came from Kuala Lumpur and Selangor. So
The Klang Valley lah.
correct. So very Klang Valley centric, very urban, right? So I think from there you can make the assumption that when it comes to mental health awareness, it's there in the urban areas. We need to do more to penetrate the rural areas, and these are things that GRG has tried to do, right? For instance, when it comes to advocating in Bahasa, right? But we've also stumbled across difficulties there because certain mental health terminology or terms, you cannot get a direct translation of it in Malay, like depression, right?
There is kemurungan, there is depresi,
but to what extent does it literally define what depression is, or rather, it's I suppose those terms are a direct translation, but it doesn't hit at the context of what depression is, which we know is very different to sadness. So those were the I think those are the two key things. Very very centric, more ladies,
Mostly millennials though.
mostly millennials, so mostly people like me and Sinatra. So in our 30s.
Yeah.
So that took the majority.
Majority of survey
surveys.
respondents.
Yeah. And what you mentioned about the differences between workplaces then and now, we actually saw in our respondents. So it's not very clear. The older generations are senior leaders, millennials are managers, and for instance, Gen Zs are because we had Gen Zs as senior leaders, Gen Zs as managers, and then we had the older generation. So we had Gen Xers and Boomers as operational roles. So
In
it's
our
very fluid.
survey
Correct.
respondents,
Yeah. So it's very fluid. We were of the assumption that those in the operational roles would be fresh graduates, young professionals, meaning people with 0 to 3 years of working experience. But you had people who, for instance, there was one respondent who had been working in her current organization for 20 years.
And she was still at the operational level.
Right? Like, fluidity, I think, when it comes to what an organization also a difference between then and now. That's just in terms of the demographics. Key findings
Key findings.
for senior leaders. So paper 2.
Key findings, I think I already mentioned one key findings, the awareness problems, and
Right.
senior leaders basically are aware of the issue, but they're not really sure what to do about it
Right.
in terms of mental health. The other one about senior leaders, I think there's a need for senior leaders to accept that there's this new reality in the workplace, in the modern workplace, that because there's always this stigma against Gen Zs, right? Because there's this stigma that Gen Zs are manja, like have high expectations, like want flexibility and all, and
Right.
kind of like, it kind of like put off many senior leaders who think like these are too much for our organizations to run, okay?
Right.
Yeah, so there's that kind of like preference for millennials over Gen Zs. But
Okay.
they also have to realize that the millennial generations are over. I mean, like the last of the millennials have entered the workforce, and from now on it would be the Gen Zs.
Yeah.
And if they are not accepting this reality, then it will be very hard for them to adapt to these changes.
Right.
So I think like one of the imperatives is for them to accept like there's this change. Gen Zs will come into your organizations, whether you like it or not, and there's something that you have to do about it. Like there has to be like two-way measures to like bridge this gap.
Yes.
Not only to expose the Gen Zs to the realities of the workplace in Malaysian context, but also for the millennials and Gen X and boomers to also like understand where the Gen Zs are coming from, like what are their socio-economic backgrounds
Yes.
and other backgrounds that they need to understand about Gen Zs, for them to turn out like this,
That's true.
you know?
Let's talk about assumptions. I mean, why do you think that is? Why do you think Gen Zs think that is? I mean, okay, based on your Gen Z paper, why do you think Gen Zs are demanding or manja? Like to me, as a Gen
Yeah.
Z, I would say because, of course, we came from we were used to the online punya working setting, right? So when it comes to demanding, actually, what are the demanding things that people are saying? Is it in terms of working arrangements, for example? Because if so, maybe it's because Gen Zs have seen that they can complete the work, like their work, they can achieve their KPIs from home.
Yeah.
So why not?
Yeah.
Why not continue that? Like people can also see that companies don't need a physical office to run. You
Yep.
see GRG, for example. Like we didn't need an office to operate fully, so why not? And then Gen Zs maybe, I think, I don't know, but maybe it's also because during the pandemic, our economy was not that good. So Gen Zs who were trying to get a job that they wanted, or rather a role that they wanted that can fully support them, maybe they couldn't find it, so they always had to look for alternatives. In maybe if I get this job that pays this much, then I would need a more flexible arrangement because then I need time to do my other side gig to earn more to support me and my living expenses. So, but throughout your research or interaction with the Gen Zs, why do you think that is so?
I think the pandemic has definitely had a major impact. We ran a very small focus group discussion for paper 3 on Gen Z, and it was very clear with our participants that the impact of the pandemic is still being felt today by Gen Zs. Like, there's no doubt about that. For instance, one Gen Z raised the point that, so people my age, we knew what work was all about before the pandemic. So if an organization today were to transition to pre-pandemic days, we can adjust because we know as to what those arrangements would be like. But for Gen Zs, they have nothing to compare it to. Not just from the start of them working, but even from the start of, for instance, university day. Yeah, right. We had a Gen Z who said she started during the pandemic. She ended also not going to like a physical lecture. So the thought of her joining a workplace and having to interact physically like scares her, she says.
She doesn't know how to interact.
She doesn't know. This was also raised by another fellow Gen Z who said that even when they transitioned to not even full-time, so more of a hybrid, but on the days that he had to go into work,
So it's a he.
he felt anxious, just not really, like for instance, not really knowing how to carry himself when it comes to interacting with his older peers.
Right.
So felt very
Awkward lah.
yeah, so felt awkward. So he always felt more comfortable at home. But when it comes to Zoom calls, he was on it, like on the ball. But when it comes to maybe physical meetings, then it was a bit like, So the pandemic, I think, is for sure a factor. The second thing I would raise is, I think, social media.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know if viewers are very active on LinkedIn. We had a senior leader say that he's not a fan of LinkedIn at all, because he says on LinkedIn, you only see what good leaders should be.
Expectations of leaders.
But you don't see what, for instance, good employees should be. So the expectation is always on senior leaders to be a certain way. And to him, he feels that the young professionals that they then employ have this perception that senior leaders should only be A, B, C, D, E, F. They cannot be anything beyond that. So that creates, I'm not sure whether the term is a false impression of what senior leaders should be, but perhaps not a realistic one. So then it creates, for instance, I suppose, misconceptions, right, or misperceptions about what the workplace actually is, or about the interactions between senior leaders and.
I understand. I mean,
so
how would
on
Gen
and so
Zs
forth.
know anyways, because they haven't been in the workplace.
I think those are the different nuances. Social media, I think, 110% plays a big factor. Yeah.
Okay.
But there's a need to deep dive, I think, on social media and mental health in general. Like, we know, I mean, so much has been said about the negative effects of social media, but I think a deep dive on the negative effects, or rather just the effects of social media in general on workplace mental health, I think that would be a pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure about
Yeah.
workplace mental health and social media, but back in uni, I did a paper on social media and relationships in general, which I think can be translated to workplace relationships as well, like relationship with your boss, relationship with your colleagues. I guess the main thing that is resulted from social media and your relationships is just expectations. What you see online may not always be the reality that you said. So I think people, when they go out, they have the expectation that you should act a certain way, and you should act like the boss should act a certain way, and I should act a certain way as well. I think on LinkedIn, I can kind of see that as well, whereby the LinkedIn mainly shows on, okay, this is my right and what I want, and this is what I want my boss to be.
Yeah.
But when they cannot find a boss or what they expect the boss to be, then they will be, okay, then I'm struggling in the workplace.
Yeah.
I'm stressed.
Yeah. It's I think it's about finding that middle ground or that common ground, which is like our aim for this research series, right? Because I think like that term workplace mental health, I think there's a positive connotation to it that has maybe gotten a bit lost. Because the workplace can be a good source. You can find purpose. If you hit your KPIs, for instance, you have a sense of achievement. You feel good about yourself, right? There's a sense of community. If you get along really well with then you have a little work family, so there is that sense of belonging. These are all things that as humans we sort of need to thrive. We sort of need to feel complete, to feel fulfilled, to feel happy. And you know, a workplace is a source of, or rather it can be a source of good from other areas of your life. Like for instance, if you have certain responsibilities in your family, in the workplace, all of that sort of goes away and you focus on something that you know you're really good at or that you're really passionate about. So the workplace can be a source of good for your mental health, and I think that is something that we should be
Focusing.
yeah, because it's not just about the differences. It can be a source of good. So I hope to deep dive into that a bit more. So I'm trying to get us 5 and 6, especially paper 5, when we want to look at the differences. I think there's a need to sort of say, well, you know, hang on, actually, there's some commonalities as well, because work can be, I mean, I suppose it's about viewing the workplace as a glass half full as opposed to a glass half empty when it comes to our mental health. Yeah.
Okay.
You wanna add
Sorry for
What else?
sorry for skipping the manager paper.
managers, I think.
Maybe
What
keep
else?
finding.
What else can I? No. I think maybe I'll add on the Gen Z bit.
Okay.
Like, I'm not an expert in social economy, but I enjoy the arguments, and I'm not a sociologist either. But I've come across these arguments that for Gen Z's parents raise their children in a more stable environment, like more socially stable, more economically secure, more politically stable as well, compared to the parents of the millennials. I mean, we went through the financial crisis, so there were a lot of uncertainties in the 80s and the early 90s at least, right? Like all those, the Iraq War, like all those like invasions. So the approach of parents like raising their children were different before 1997 and post 1997. 1997 being the first year that the first Gen Zs were born, right?
Yeah.
So it kind of like translates in the way like Gen Zs also formulate their worldview, because their parents they grew up in a more stable environment. Their parents like jaga them more. Millennial parents they had to struggle raising their children in a world that might be less secure, might be less stable.
Uncertain,
So they had to like kind of like inculcate all this sense of like you have to be more responsible. You have to with yourself. If we are not around, you have to like look after yourself. Right? That kind of thing.
I have a question on that then.
Yeah.
Would you say that the grit or the resilience between millennials, boomers, Gen Xers, and above will be different compared to Gen Z?
I think the context will be different. Like, the context and how they formulate this resilience based on the experiences that they grew up with. I mean, just an example, I grew up during the financial crisis, and it completely formed the basis of how I approach situations like what if there's a crisis in the country, okay? Like, how do you approach money? Because it was a financial crisis, right? Everything was uncertain. So it really formed my perception towards money, my perception towards job, my perception towards myself that, okay, you can have money, but in one day they can all be like swept away, okay? Which I think pandemic kind of become your generation's punya experience,
Financial crisis, yeah. and
your version of
Mini
financial crisis,
financial crisis.
slash like health crisis slash like global
yes.
crisis.
Global crisis.
Yeah, so it would become. I think that would form the way that Gen Zs would approach when they become parents.
Okay.
But that's beside the point, lah.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that Gen Zs have their own experience that differ from millennials and
Right.
Gen X.
Right.
To answer, like we had a manager in oil and gas. So she's a millennial, so our age, in her 30s, and she was literally hitting this point that you just made on the level of grit between different destinations or generations, right? And she more or less said that, I actually don't blame my senior leader or my manager, who's a senior leader, for being hard on me. They grew up through difficult times, so their level of grit, like I'm literally like quoting, their level of grit is just different. Like we will not understand it at that time.
Yeah.
So their level of grit and perseverance is different. So this concept of mental health and being mentally healthy is so foreign to them, because in their time it just wasn't something that they paid attention to. It was just push.
Yeah.
And even now, like my mom will always tell me, like, last time when I was young, I didn't have all this mental health, whatever you're talking about now.
Yes.
Like it didn't
Same.
exist. I didn't know what mental health was. I didn't know.
Yes.
But now suddenly it's like everywhere. People are saying that they are suddenly, not mentally healthy, or they're saying that they have mental health problems. But actually, like, what is it? Like, you just need to get on with life. Just life goes on, and you just go with the flow. So yeah, there is definitely a different level of grit. It doesn't mean one generation is stronger than the next. It really comes down to what you have experienced, and your understanding of it. And I think these are some key takeaways that we will be taking into papers 5 and 6. So that is, I think there'll be a really interesting discussion come November, December, once we sort of hit those remaining two papers.
Yeah. I think that level of grit, it can also, I will also debate that the level of grit may also be your level of empathy towards your subordinates, for example. But I think that's a discussion for a different day.
But it doesn't mean to say that Gen Zs do not have resilience.
Definitely.
The Gen Zs that we interview, like majority of them displayed a degree of resilience that were not shown in other Gen Zs, for example. Like there was this one Gen Z who said like she had to go through all these like very harsh conditions at work, like travel, like getting scolded at, and cry in the car, doing whatever. But when she shows up at work, she had to give it 100%. Like she had to like cater to the job, like deliver to the clients and all that. Like, so she suffered through all this, but she's kind of like starting to build like this resilience like organically from it. And this is also displayed by others that we have engaged last time.
I think that's a nice word to use, organic resilience.
Yeah.
Like resilience is not taught.
Yeah.
And I think Gen Z is like me and generations after me, we have to go through something in order for us to know what resilience is anyways and how to navigate through the workplace anyways. But okay, some key points on managers before we wrap it
Key
up.
point is manager. Oh, they need training. Don't you agree, Ariane? And this is not me saying that managers need training. The managers that we interviewed themselves admit that, okay, we understand that there's this mental health imperatives, but how can we, because there's so much expectations on manager to address their employees' mental health, mental well-being, right? But they don't know how to do about it. So they don't even, some that we interviewed do not even know how to create that safe space or even using the right words to approach delicate conversations. I think one even said that, I don't know if I talk to them whether I'm making it worse or better for them because I don't know what words I should use, right? So one of the conclusions that we made was that, okay, perhaps there's a need for managers to go through certain trainings, developmental programs, not only for them to equip them with the ability to create a safe space, but also like to have the right approach to having mental health related conversations with the employees. Because it can be very sensitive, right, these issues.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that was the biggest takeaway. And I think senior leaders also, a few of them raised the point of, actually, is it on me or the manager to sort of manage workplace? I think managers in general feel the brunt of workplace mental health problems because those who I suppose young professionals or those in the operational roles will look up to them and say what, and then I think those in the senior leader positions will look down on them and say, what are you doing about it? So this whole managers being the middleman or being the sandwich tier designation, I think that's really felt. Across, it was apparent in their responses to our survey and apparent in the 7 or 8 that we interviewed. So I think when it comes to workplace mental health awareness and training, there is a need to deep dive into managers specifically, just being that middle tier. And being able to offer two-way support, and most of all, I think being able to manage their own mental health.
Yes.
Aware
Not only for
of
others.
what they need to do, because if they're burnt out, then really the tiers below and above.
An important point, like in the survey, I think, there's that expectations for managers to address their employees' mental health, mental well-being. But we also found in the survey that majority of managers cannot open up to others in their organizations, right?
To others, meaning like the ones like that their subordinates or
their
their
peers,
leaders.
to open up to their colleagues that they're suffering from burnout, for example.
Okay.
So the point that you made about managers need to look after themselves is very valid.
Can't pour from an empty cup, you know. So you need to do what you can for yourself first. I think.
Okay. Sinatra, do you have anything else to add?
My favorite point ever. I'm approaching it from a demographic perspective. Okay,
Right.
so first of all, as you say, like only 30% of our survey respondents are men.
Men.
And it's reflected throughout all of our papers, all of our interviews, that men only made up like 1/3 of the entire interviewees. So obviously men are underrepresented in this research, and we that's one of the gaps that I think we need to close as we move forward, right? So one of the measures that we can consider at this point is how we can sort of like normalize this conversation on mental health among men, because we always go back to this point about raising awareness, right? But if you do not have the capacity to talk to men about it or make men comfortable to talk about mental health with the right vocabulary, then it will be very hard for you to achieve that level of mental health awareness in Malaysia alone.
Right.
And to add to that point, I think it's written in our paper 4 that majority of the workforce in Malaysia is like men. So if you want to tackle workplace mental health, you need to tackle the men in the workplace.
To raising awareness on mental health in general.
And I only dare to speak about this because one of our interviewees, actually, she said that mental health conversations in Malaysia is femininized.
Feminized. That's an interesting, but I also don't disagree with that.
That makes many men like approach it in a more like, this is not for us. Like, let's not talk about mental health because it goes back to being seen as weak, like incapable, or like not having it together. You know, that kind of like stigma. So
I think it's a general, perception that women are more emotional enemies just because of our practice. I think it's derived from our cultural practices also, where women are supposed to stay at home, so they're more emotional. They're supposed to care more anyway.
Exactly.
And men are just supposed to be the providers, and they have to like put on that, I'm not weak mask.
Exactly. All my dudes, all my friends, they still consider mental health as a very female thing, you know, and emotional being the only domain of girls and females, right? Not men.
Okay.
So even among my social circle, there's still that stigma. Sorry if you are listening to this. I'm sorry. I'm just stating the fact that you've been saying all these things, and it's a social issue that I think we need to look into if we still want to raise this awareness.
Agenda forward.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for tuning in to our discussion today. Thank you for your thoughts and perceptions. And I think just to close everything up, we will be having a second episode again on this workplace series on papers 5 and 6 in December once it's up. So we will see you again soon for that. But just to close everything, I think like what you mentioned just now, I think it's important for us to keep the conversation going, because only if we do start, then other people start talking about it too. Right? It's a domino effect, like we always say, right? So that's that. We'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.